In a nutshell, GDP basically is working age population plus productivity. And if population declines, that means more leverage or debt is required to maintain that GDP level, unless there's a commensurate amount of productivity making up for it. Now, the problem is when debt to GDP gets to 90% or higher. The interest alone on that debt at that point will increase the total debt amount, which is what's commonly referred to as a debt spiral. So GDP is basically just a metric for measuring the value any country generates through its economy. All the people in the economy produce goods and services that get added up into one big number. And demographics is just a fancy way of saying population. Now, why am I bringing these two things up together? Well, because they're extremely related. The biggest drivers of the value generation that ultimately makes up GDP are the number of workers, demographics, and the efficiency of that work, which is productivity.
Totally.
In terms of demographics, more people doing and creating things will naturally lead to more things being done and created.
That was easy.
So larger populations are a big factor in GDP. But population obviously isn't everything. Otherwise, nations like China and India would be far ahead of countries like the US.
I'm really rich.
That said, productivity, which is what accounts for that discrepancy between countries like India and the US, can only take you so far.
What?
If one country is 2 times more productive than another country that has 4 times the population, the latter is still likely going to have a higher GDP.
Little bitch.
So both metrics are extremely important, but sometimes one can really take a backseat to the other. As an example, when a population ages,
Come on, man.
and there aren't enough people entering the workforce to replace the ones leaving, productivity can't always keep up with the decline in output that follows from a smaller workforce. If a population is consistently declining, productivity has to increase a commensurate amount, or GDP is also going to decline. I bring this up because countries all around the world, including the US and China, are in the midst of a serious demographic problem. To focus specifically on the US and China, the massive US baby boomer generation is headed into retirement, with significantly fewer citizens taking their place. And the China one-child policy is finally wreaking havoc on China's working age population. What this means is both countries, and plenty of other countries dealing with similar population crises, are going to significantly contract, absent some massive spike in productivity. Or a huge amount of leverage, which is just another way of saying excessive debt, to make up the difference.
For real? You fuck with that?
As you can probably assume, most countries have opted for the leverage path, because it's easier. And that is why we see the deficit spending through the roof. For governments to make up for the loss in GDP, they need to lever up with debt, and that is a huge part of why deficits keep growing and will continue to grow amid further demographic declines.
Oh, hell no.
But when debt to GDP ratios get to about 90%, interest on that debt alone will keep increasing the total amount of debt, which is why inflation will likely be a progressively more important tool of central banks to lower their absolute value of debt and get back to more sustainable levels, which is obviously far from ideal, but potentially better than a deflationary depression. So from basically the beginning of recorded history up until about the 1970s, the world population was headed significantly higher and roughly peaked around the 1970s. Since then, world population has been on a steep decline, and this is problematic because that forces the economy to contract. If there's less working people contributing to the value generation of all the economies, then there is going to be less value, less GDP, lower GDP for those economies. And to make up for that, you either have to dramatically increase productivity, which is much easier said than done.
Totally.
Or you lever the hell up. You increase your debt and you keep the ball rolling by kicking the can down the road. Now, there is no official constraint on leverage, and that is the problem, but it is not sustainable. If the population continues to decline and GDP with it, you can only add to a deficit so much before faith is lost in that currency, that government, whatever it may be. Now, this second picture, for those who are watching, is of the public and private debt as a percentage of GDP. So as you can see, Since a little after the 1970s, call it 1980s, it has been on a steep upward trajectory. And this graph right here includes US, China, the EU, and Japan, which are the major economies. Obviously not all of them, but let's be real. And debt for both public and private sectors has been dramatically increasing. And there are obviously a lot of factors that contribute to that. For the US, having to constantly generate a trade deficit to supply the world with dollars is a huge part of it, known as the Triffin's paradox, but I'll save that for another Market Taker episode. Aww. Nevertheless, debt is increasing dramatically as a percentage of GDP, and that is because you need to keep adding debt to keep that can rolling. Now, it's anybody's guess how long that can be kicked down the road, but this is an important metric to keep in mind because, as mentioned, when the debt to GDP ratio exceeds 90%, you start getting into debt spiral territory. And countries like the US and Japan, and really every other developed country is working their way toward it as well, but US and Japan specifically have far exceeded that, well over 130%. And once you reach those levels, it becomes exceedingly difficult to get back to a more sustainable level below 90%, especially when you have demographic problems that require productivity to make up the difference, absent of that leverage or debt continuing to pile up. Yep. All right, that does it for this 101. But as always, stay happy, humble, and most importantly, solvent.